We are live. I feel like we're on broadcast television. Welcome everyone joining us in person and online. We're going to try our best to make sure today's event really feels hybrid, also for those online that they feel a part of the room. In a moment, hopefully you see their faces populated on the screen here, which reminds me to encourage those of you who are online to please turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable doing so. It'd be really nice to get a sense for, who's in the room. We will be recording this event because some people couldn't join us in person today or online, and we also want to share this conversation and the outcomes of it as widely as possible. So if you don't feel comfortable with it being recorded, you can either change your name and or turn your camera off. Please keep your mics muted during the individual interventions. Messina, the moderator today, will prompt you to share your reflections throughout the event, but there will be dedicated time at the end for a discussion Q&A, during which time we'll encourage you to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or make a point, and Messina will call on you to ask your question directly here with your cameras on. If you want to ask anonymously, you can message the KPSRL Secretariat in the chat, and then I will voice your question for you. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Messina Lorette Manirakita, who will moderate today's event, and she will welcome the speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I do have a mic. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on your location. I know some are joining from different parts of the world online. Welcome to the Feminist Foreign Policy event, a feminist way forward for security and rule of law development cooperation. A big greeting for those connected online as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this conversation hosted by the knowledge platform Security and Rule of Law. My name is Messina Lorette Manirakita, and as Melissa said, I will be moderating this conversation. I'll try to be brief and turn now to our incredible speakers to tap into their expertise and experience. As you know, we are gathered tonight to discuss implications of feminist foreign policies on security and rule of law development cooperation. The emergence of feminist foreign policies since Sweden blazed the trail in 2014 has attracted considerable interest as an alternative approach to promoting gender equality and the empowerment of women in external action. While many of its goals do overlap with long-standing commitments on women, peace and security, and gender equality in development and humanitarian assistance, feminist foreign policies can, at the very least, provide, first of all, a unifying political banner and framework for disparate strands of gender-related strategies. It can improve coordination and effectiveness. And last but not least, it is a clear and visible brand that makes it easier for the public, for civil society to really hold governments accountable to their commitments to advance gender equality. Two questions currently dominate the feminist foreign policy debate. What is a feminist foreign policy? What should it be? And how can the feminist foreign policies implemented by governments be evaluated both against its own objectives but also from broader feminist perspectives? The political practice has been followed by academic efforts to really clarify the concept and develop theory building from different feminist approaches, which is great. But we do know that from programming and policy side, especially in the field of security and rule of law, there are still gaps and a lot to unpack. And this is why we are here tonight. And I think we are all well prepared to do that, because we do have, as I said, three exceptional speakers, and I will be in a minute introducing them. But we also do have a room, both in person but also online, full of expertise and experience. So before we dive deep into the conversation, allow me to introduce our three speakers. I will start with Dr. Jutta Joachim, Associate Professor of Global Security Governance. Dr. Jutta holds a PhD in Political Sciences from University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MA in International Studies from University of South Carolina. She is an author and co-editor of publications on private security, gender violence, and transnational activism. Dr. Jutta, welcome, and thanks for being with us tonight. Our second speaker is Alejandra Vicente. She is the head of law at Redress. Previously, she was the legal director of the Center for Justice and International Law, SRoL, and she is a member of the Secretariat of the GQUAL campaign, which seeks to achieve gender parity in the composition of international courts and human rights tribunals. Thank you very much for being with us, Alejandra, and please, could you just join me on the stage? Last but not least, let me introduce Fridah. Fridah Githuku is a gender and women rights expert working with and for traditionally excluded grassroots communities. She is the current executive director of Groots Kenya, a national movement of grassroots women and girls in Kenya. She is the global co-chair of the International Land Coalition and a 2019 Landak Fellow. Welcome, Fridah, and thanks for being with us tonight. All right, let me go back to Dr. Jutta because I would like to ask her to help us set the scene. There are so many versions, so many nuances from one country to another when it comes to feminist foreign policies. And we know there is no standard blueprint on how to develop these policies. And then my first question to you, Dr. Jutta, is what is a feminist foreign policy? What are key nuances we should be aware of, and how is this different from previous similar but not so similar policies? Please go ahead, Dr. Jutta.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen if I can. Sorry. Wait. Can you all see?
Yeah. Yes,
yeah?
We can.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you, Messina, for the nice introduction, and also Melissa for organizing this event. And I feel very honored to be on the same panel with Fridah and Alejandra, whose work I deeply admire and respect. So to answer your question, Messina, it's a difficult question and a difficult answer to give. I titled my brief introduction calling it Feminist Foreign Policy and Security, a Contradiction in Terms. And I would answer that question with in the affirmative manner, because a feminist foreign policy is an antithesis to traditional foreign policy, to power politics and realpolitik as we know it. It is a political framework. It presents an alternative vision which sets new behavioral standards for foreign policy. As former Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, who was trailblazing feminist foreign policy, stated at the time, such a policy affords a different and potentially more controversial politics. It involves leaving the comfort zone of merely agreeing on that gender matters. And I think that's the important part. Traditionally, we have kind of focused, oh, gender matters occasionally and when it's convenient. But a feminist foreign policy really calls us in multiple ways to question this traditional approach centered around the well-being of marginalized people. It invokes processes of critical self-reflection on traditional foreign policy and the hierarchical global systems on which it is based, including patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, heteronormativity, racism, militarism. I could go on with the isms. It also asks us to step outside the black box approach of traditional foreign policy thinking, and it's available, or thus far available, toolbox focused on military force, violence, and domination. Instead, it really asks us to engage in alternate and intersectional rethinking of security from the viewpoint of the most vulnerable. What that precisely means, I would elaborate on in 4 ways. But before I do so, I would briefly want to highlight more specifically how feminist foreign policies has evolved, and also the differences between how it's approached by the countries which thus far have adopted explicitly a feminist foreign policy. And I can only say that it's by now just a handful, and not even anymore, because while Sweden started off this trend of adopting explicitly a feminist foreign policy in 2014, it's already distanced itself from it with the election of a new government. Following were Canada, France, Mexico, and most recently Germany. But when studying their approaches and their feminist foreign policies, you can also already notice differences. Each and every one has developed their own brand, their own version of feminist foreign policy. Starting with Sweden and Canada, which took a rather slim or lean approach to feminist foreign policy. Sweden with its 3R approach, calling for equal rights, representation, and resources for women equal to men. And Canada, which limited its feminist policy to foreign assistance politics and economic empowerment of women and girls. This is contrary to then following countries, France, Mexico, and Germany, who kind of took a more comprehensive approach, emphasizing that feminist concerns need to be stressed and included in all affairs and all matters of foreign policy, as well as the intersectionality needs to be an implicit and an important lens through which foreign policy is viewed, but also that self-reflection on one's own foreign policy establishment is necessary. I should also highlight that even though we have a handful of countries which until now have explicitly adopted feminist foreign policy, there are countries who have started to include feminist concerns and gender concerns in their foreign policy matters, though varying by different issue areas. This is shown by a study conducted by the International Center for Research on Women. And I'm happy to report that some countries are not doing poorly, including the Netherlands, which ranks among the top 10 in that matter. Perhaps I shouldn't say that to kind of not disincentivize the ambition to also develop a feminist foreign policy here. With this brief excursion into the history of feminist foreign policy, what does it explicitly mean to adopt a feminist foreign policy with respect to security? And I have 4 points in that respect. The first one being that it really demands for us to shift away from an exclusive focus, which has been thus far the exclusive focus of violence against women and girls and their empowerment, and a shift toward intersectional rethinking of security from the viewpoint of the most vulnerable. This means that we also need to regard and take into the view the sexual violence and insecurity experienced by gays and lesbians, transsexuals, but also by men. Who are violated because of their sex, because of their gendered identities, because of their ethnicity and religion, and who you could argue face even greater invisibility in the conflict-ridden society. And studies show that even greater stigmatization and tabooization surrounds the violence that they experience and makes them very reluctant to even speak about the insecurities and the harassment and the sexual abuse they've been faced with. But it also means potentially to make tough choices, policy choices, because deciding on who is the most vulnerable is not an easy task. As my colleague Charlie Carpenter has shown with respect to the genocide which occurred in the enclave of Srebrenica in 1995, UNHCR was rescuing women, children, and the elderly out of from the bombardment of the Bosnian Serb army, when in fact it was young male of combatant, potential combatants who were the most vulnerable, and actually turned out 8,000 of them turned out to be massacred and mass executed. So we really need to reflect critically from condition to condition and from scenery to scenery, who is indeed the most vulnerable when we conduct a feminist foreign policy. Second, it also asks us to move away from a state-centric thinking and toward an acknowledgement that conflicts today are very complex, involving not only state militaries and state actors, but increasingly, and I think Ukraine is a perfect example for that, increasingly mercenary groups, private military and security companies, rebels, militias, all of which are non-state actors, but which use, sometimes even more ferociously, sexual violence as a weapon of war. But with the dilemma that these non-state actors are not subject or no subjects of international law, and sometimes really hard to prosecute their deeds, therefore. Third, when applying feminist foreign policy to security, this also means really critically reflecting our own privileges, our colonial past, and the uneven relationships, power relationships we put into place, and the exploitative relationships we maintain until today with the global South, which are the foundation of the very privileges and the security we in the global North enjoy at the expense of people in the global South. But furthermore, it implies critically reflecting on our perspective of the global South people, to move away from our presumed white superiority and viewing people in the global South as from an Oriental perspective, and mostly thinking that they are victims, less capable, of lesser agency, and sometimes also the inherently more dangerous. It, in fact, requires us, such a feminist foreign policy, to view of them as capable agents, equals, and individuals from whom we can learn, whose indigenous knowledge may actually be the key to the out-of-box thinking that feminist foreign policy asks us to engage in, and to look for the solutions today to global crises and problems. And last but not least, and I stop here, this feminist foreign policy also asks us to not only engage in outward looking with efforts at other society, but instead to also engage in inward looking, to adopt an inward looking perspective. Which doesn't stop at just a numeric inclusion of underrepresented individuals and groups, but goes beyond that and really provides a zero tolerance and the sanctioning of the violence and the harassment that occurs within or within the own foreign policy establishment, inside, but also during and in the course of deployment abroad. To conclude, and I really want to put this to question, a feminist foreign policy is a demanding undertaking and far away from a just small reform. It affords genuine honesty, critical and continuous self-reflection, empathy, inclusivity, humbleness, tolerance, and dialogue. Hence, a politics quite contrary from the traditional realpolitik and power politics we are used to. It presents an alternative, challenging vision, but one we desperately need. And with that, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jutta. This was really, really informative. I think you've really laid solid foundation for this conversation, as you've been touching on the different trends, different nuances, but also I like the way you were highlighting from a security perspective what this kind of policy means. And on a personal note, I'm very you know, it's very striking for me when I hear you talking about who is the most vulnerable, right? Because we tend to define that using cliches, and I also like when you say that it has to be also inward looking. But I'll stop here, and then I'm just checking if there is any fresh reaction, question, comments. I do have a lot to say, but yeah, I also need to make sure that you get an opportunity to react to Dr. Jutta's presentation online. You also do have an opportunity to share your comments. It doesn't have to be a question. As we've said at the beginning of this conversation, we will have a proper Q&A, but I just want to make sure that if there is any burning comment or question about what Jutta was saying.
We have one hand raised.
Yeah. Please go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't see your name.
Me? I'm Fridah in London. Hi. Thanks very much. I'm sorry, I lost sound a little bit, so I don't know if the question I've got has already been covered in your presentation, Jutta. So I had a couple of points, really. One is the countries where FPP has been in place or is in the works, as you mentioned. Is there any sign of anything happening similarly outside the OECD? So foreign policy, not just issues of humanitarian and security focused work. And secondly, you said at the end, I had put this question before, so I was really glad you came to it, but I'd like to know a little bit more. You said about looking inwards as well as looking outwards. And I'm curious if there's any work that looks at potential alignment or misalignment between what's being done on a foreign stage and what's being done domestically. Because it's so much easier for states to, if I exaggerate a bit, but to grandstand internationally, yet not deliver those same sorts of promises and standards to their domestic context. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Dr. Jutta, would you like to react?
Sure. I hope I understood acoustically your questions, and please correct me if I didn't. But what I can tell so far, and from the countries that have been explicitly adopting such a feminist foreign policy, is that much is that it remains still very timid in the results, and that they can continue to engage in more the traditional habit, which they have been focusing on humanitarian assistance, development assistance, the empowerment of women, and combating violence against women. And this is for a reason. You can show results, right? I mean, this is something we have to get away from, to just focus on quantitative indicator elements, but rather move also to the structural problems that really are undergirding gender equality and gender hierarchies. So I'm still rather not overwhelmed by by what has been happening. And one could say that perhaps Ukraine war has kind of gotten in the way, but I think that would have been also a very good opportunity to kind of practice that. And secondly, with respect to the disalignment between internal and external focus, yes, indeed, there is a disalignment or a kind of disconnect. Countries are not necessarily preaching what they're not necessarily practicing what they're preaching. You know, we are seeing an increase in armament without critical reflection on what that does. We are seeing a double-sided treatment of refugees incoming, with those coming from the global south being differently treated than those from the global north. And we're also not seeing yet overwhelmingly increase in the representation of underrepresented in the foreign policy bureaucracy. This is just to briefly answer or give some answers to what I think were your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Jutta. Anyone else in the room before we move to Alejandra? I actually know that from our previous conversation, Alejandra touched on the inward looking part as well, and it's probably coming up in her pitch, but before we officially, we do have, please, Nopo, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My comment is...
sorry.
No worries. Hello? Oh, it's on, okay, great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's very interesting that you highlighted the inward-looking aspect. As you mentioned, that's very important also when we talk about the global north, global south debate, and often countries in the global south feel like they're being sort of imposed upon or in a very condescending manner being presented these policies without domestic application of it, because there is much gap in the global north as well. I'm wondering, where do you see the interlinkages with, for example, the Dutch National Action Plan on WPS? Where do the two internal sort of feminist foreign policy engage with the National Action Plan on WPS? Do you think they strengthen each other? Do you think they're overlapping frameworks? I mean, they do speak about similar issues. So how does that work? And why do you think an internal feminist foreign policy would work better than, let's say, a national action plan on WPS?
Very good question. I was partially not hearing everything, but I think I got the gist of your answer and again, or your question, and please feel free to interrupt if I'm not answering. But for me, frankly, feminist foreign policy is kind of a different envelope for the women, peace and security agenda. It's just a repackaging of that agenda, an agenda which was framed with the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, and called for a gender mainstreaming of security, which was mainly interpreted as a numeric representation of women in peace negotiations, but also in armed forces and international fora, as well as a fight against violence against women. So it very much is in line with that and very much overlaps with that agenda. What you can say perhaps is new and a great potential for feminist foreign policy is that it really got moved up to the executive level, right? That rather than being located in the development branch or the ministries, using or responsible for development cooperation, now we have the foreign offices taking this on and pushing putting themselves behind feminist foreign policy. And I think this is a new angle, and this is a great potential, which we have yet to see the results. And I think also what is an important dimension, at least when we look at some of the feminist foreign policies, is that intersectionality is at least verbally paid tribute to, and also that there is also at least the ambition to look inward and self-reflect on one's own behavior. But as I mentioned in response to the previous speaker, that we have yet to see what comes of that. I hope this answers your question.
I'm trying to be mindful of the time, but 1 second. I know you can do that, Rhea.
Yeah,
Mike. Yeah, sorry.
yes, just to connect to the previous question, when we discussed feminist foreign policy, do you also see the word feminist being used in national policies or action plans, or is it in a way sort of being used only in relation to foreign policy? So I was just curious if you have any experience on that.
Again, very good question. It's interesting because for a while, the word feminist was really a lightning rod, right? And was avoided. It was everything was about gender. That seemed more a common denominator, although also in part in international fora like the UN, at certain times a lightning rod. But with this introduction of a feminist foreign policy, we see this term for the first time again. And I think it is consciously chosen by both those who have pushed from below, the civil society actors and scholars who have pushed for this kind of policy, but also by the policymakers who are advocating this kind of, or who have announced that kind of policy, to really make a point. This is a politics, right? It is about politics, and it is it's no longer just a mutual agreement. It requires activism, and it requires also opposition and challenging until here to taken for granted assumptions. So at least this is what I observe, and to be also, and I could say this is a new nuance and a difference to what we've seen so far, that feminism has made it, back into the vocabulary, and also a symbol and a sign towards the anti-feminist movements we are seeing appearing, the anti-feminist policies we are seeing throughout Europe, but also elsewhere. So it's a conscious choice to adopt this term and name it a feminist foreign policy at this point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jutta. I think we've, in a way, started to cover subcomponents of security and rule of law, and then what are the implications of a feminist foreign policy. And then I would like now to turn out to Alejandra. And Alejandra, can you explain us a little bit to what extent such a policy can have an impact on ensure gender equality in the security and rule of law sector, particularly in access to justice programming initiatives, and why it is really important from an access to justice perspective?
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Messina, and for putting together this important event. And I'm also honored to share this panel with you and Fridah. It's really important. And I would say that, first of all, to assess the impact of a feminist foreign policy in ensuring gender equality, and particularly in guaranteeing access to justice, we have to first look at the baseline, and then we have to look at why, the reasons why it is important for access to justice that we have gender parity and gender equality. In relation to the current situation of gender equality in the justice sector, one of the main strategies of the GQUAL campaign has been to systematize information that didn't exist before, to show how women are underrepresented in international justice institutions. And here I have to note the caveat that the campaign focuses mainly in international positions to international courts and bodies. But I think the numbers are very telling. For example, in relation to international tribunals, from the 79 positions monitored by GQUAL, only 26 are women. This is 33%. You will not be surprised by this number if you consider that the International Court of Justice has only had 5 women out of 110 judges in 75 years of existence. Overall, we monitor 578 international positions. This is the total number of international positions, and only 234 are occupied by women. And even though sometimes we see gender parity being achieved at the level of the UN or the special procedures, we cannot assume an upward trend towards gender parity, because we have seen many times that bodies and institutions that had achieved gender parity then go back to underrepresentation. So just to give some examples, in some regional tribunals, such as the Court of Justice of the Andean Community, there are no women at all. The Caribbean Court of Justice has 1 woman out of 7 members. Here in The Hague, the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals currently has 8 women out of 25 judges. The European Court of Human Rights has 15 women out of 44 judges. The UN Committee on the Protection of Migrant Workers has 3 women out of 14 members, and the Committee Against Torture, which is very dear to my other part of my work at Redress, currently has only 3 women out of 10 members. And there are elections this year for that committee, and we have been calling very loudly states to nominate women. And so far, there are 16 candidates, and only 3 of those are women. So it's not going very well. So at the international level, women are underrepresented. But even though this is not the focus of the GQUAL campaign, unfortunately, the trend also stands for national courts. And for example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has estimated that women hold only 33.6% judicial positions in Supreme Courts in OECD countries. And CEPAL has estimated in 2021 that in Latin America, the percentage of women ministers in high courts is also only 30%. So this is what it looks like in terms of representation in international and national high courts, at least. But why do we think that gender representation and gender parity is important in international institutions, justice institutions, and why it is important for all, for everyone to have access to these justice institutions, not only women? First of all, gender in justice institutions is important to uphold the principle of equality and non-discrimination. The equal participation of women in justice spaces is a necessary step to guarantee that women are included in some of the most important and consequential decision-making spaces. And it's in these spaces that critical decisions are taken that affect climate change, peace and security, boundaries between states, law of the sea, I mean, you name it. It's the framework that really triggers the most important decisions at the national, regional, and international level. In this regard, it is so important that the CEDAW committee is actually at this moment developing a new general recommendation on inclusive representation of women in decision-making systems. And actually Article 8 of the CEDAW Convention includes the obligation for states to take measures to ensure that women participate in international spaces. So it's not an aspiration, it's an obligation by states that women are represented. It's not only a matter of equality. As the second reason, I would say that gender equality also affects the legitimacy and impact of justice institutions, and this is one important reason. So even though a decision could be fair from a substantive perspective, the legitimacy is also very much affected by the composition and the representation of the body making the decision, and whether it reflects those that are affected by that decision or that judgment. And third, gender equality is key so that the lives and experiences of women are reflected. And the current female judges of the International Court of Justice highlighted in March the importance of advancing women candidates for these very reasons of equality, legitimacy, and impact. And in the words of Judge Hilary Charlesworth, best decisions are made when a range of perspectives with different backgrounds are represented around the table. This is what she said. And she also highlighted the symbolic significance of having women at the court, as it is sending a powerful message about the position of women in general. That gender parity is important for these reasons has been highlighted lately in different spaces. It's been highlighted by the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee in a report that was issued in 2022, and in the Americas, just in the last General Assembly, the Inter-American Commission on Women has also highlighted the importance of gender parity in international justice institutions. The Human Rights Council 53rd session just opened in the last few days, and the High Commissioner Volker Turk noted that in relation to the UN treaty bodies, for them to be effective, their membership must also be diverse and gender balanced. And so the question, this is the context, but why are feminist foreign policies important in this context? As Jutta said, I mean, to the extent that they break with racism, colonial, patriarchal power structures by prioritizing peace, gender equality, environmental integrity across all levels of foreign policy, they are relevant to influence equality in the justice sector. And feminist foreign policies recognize the current imbalance that exists and seek to change those structures of power. So if we look at the commitments made by states who have either adopted a feminist foreign policy or have made commitments, we will see that almost all include gender equality representation in decision-making spaces to some extent or another. Some of them, such as Spain, for example, has made more concrete commitments to increase the participation of women in international institutions. And this is really interesting in relation to the question that Nupur was posing before, because we see that there is a trend by the Global South to also adopt feminist foreign policies, and I think there is a very interesting a chance that they will be able to show perhaps even better what it means for their governments. So this is why I think the policies are important, but what does it mean in practice, right? Because we are, feminist foreign policies are very nice, we see these big commitments, big letters, but I mean, what does it mean in practice? And sometimes, well, I think the area is developing, so there is probably not a clear answer, and we have heard this also from members of the diplomatic corps, that they don't really know yet how it implies or implicates and impacts their work on a daily basis. But for our discussion, we see that sometimes feminist foreign policies promote gender equality, for example, by increasing development aid for projects that include gender equality component or funding women's rights organizations. And while this is important, we think that with a feminist foreign policy, countries should ensure that the policy doesn't only target development aid, but all actions of the External Action Service. And here, in our view, it's very important to look internally. So as someone was saying before, not only look at how it impacts development aid or the action of that country in third countries, but also in the states adopting the policy. Just a few days ago, it was the International Day, I think, of diplomatic women. And it was reported this year that only 26% of permanent representatives at the UN are women. And the message I saw said, you know, at this pace, it will take 30 years to have gender parity. So obviously governments with a feminist foreign policy should have more pressure to make sure that what is in the policy really reflects as well in the external action offices of that country. In relation to parity in international courts and bodies, the GQUAL campaign has proposed very concrete actions for states with a feminist foreign policy. Those for those that have adopted policies and also for those that have made commitments. In practice, we think that this means opening transparent processes to nominate candidates when international positions become available for election. And actually, this doesn't only benefit women, as we have heard before, but feminist foreign policies, by challenging some of the structures that have not allowed women to come into the picture, also open the door to other groups that have been out of the debate, such as members of the LGBTI community. We are also asking states not only to nominate women into international positions, but also to vote. Because we know how it works. It's a political process, it's a trading process of votes that takes place at the international level, and that means political commitment to back up women candidates internationally. But also states can play a role in ensuring that new treaties set up monitoring bodies that in their rules ensure that there is representation, equal representation of women. So to conclude with this introduction, Messina, at the GQUAL campaign, we are happy that there is so much attention on the feminist foreign policy debate, because we think it's a real opportunity to change the picture of international justice and to improve the access of justice for all, to have more legitimate institutions that will deliver better decisions for everyone. Thanks, I will leave it here.
So much. No, thank you so much. I was reflecting when you were, when you were speaking about the fact that all the key questions and angles actually you were posing do provide an opportunity to actually redistribute power. And I was like, if we think and if we argue that the feminist foreign policy should actually tackle those imbalances and dismantle patriarchy and restore that equilibrium, questions of legitimacy, equality and inclusion, bringing a human rights-based approach are actually quite key. So thank you so much. Melissa?
We have a few people online who have a few thoughts.
Yeah.
Yerker was first. If you'd like to call him Yerker.
Say it again, her name?
Yerker.
Yerker, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, I made some comments there. Well, first of all, thank you for the invite and thanks for the presentation, Jutta. I think that, it's a very interesting analysis. So I work in this program called Countering Backlash, Reclaiming Gender Justice, with partners in 6 countries. And it's the Global South, and we work in development studies, development primarily, as opposed to international relations and security. Although some countries are conflict affected, such as Uganda and Lebanon. So my question or suggestion was the idea that by turning the lens, we have feminist foreign policies in a number of countries, and I've been following very closely. And of course, a lot of the language and discourse around this has been around gender balance in mechanisms for peace and security and in parliaments and so on. And we've therefore focused on kind of numbers and which brings a risk of a gender essentialism, that if you can only get more women into parliament, etc., you will have justice and peace. Now, there may be some truth in that, but it's not the entire problem. So if you turn the lens around to focus on the patriarchal, and as I said, I'm focusing on backlash, we are focusing on backlash, the current moment in history when we see massive anti-feminist pushback in various forms across the globe, from Brazil to America to you name it, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Russia, everywhere, Middle East. So my perspective is what's behind this. It's not as if this is just about gender, in fact. And there hasn't been a great deal of progress on gender equality in a lot of these countries, actually. It's about much more than gender. But my view is that it's still gendered. It is patriarchal. The performance of these politics is very patriarchal indeed. And it's the kind of a response to crises in systems and kind of global orders taking shape in international relations being fractured. And what we're seeing is this kind of using gender and feminism as lightning rods, along with LGBTQI issues, to play domestic politics in a very authoritarian and populist way, to get the population with you on very dangerous projects, like in Russia, for example, in order to pursue very patriarchal objectives of reestablishing some kind of sense of order and control. And this is an evolving picture. And I think the global politics at the moment is incredibly, well, we've all seen how divisive and binary it becomes. And LGBTQI and feminism is being mobilized very instrumentally in this politics. Meanwhile, we're talking about feminist foreign policies and quotas in parliaments and in peace and security structures and at the UN CSW, for example. And I'm not saying that work doesn't need to be done. Of course it does. The question is, are we sort of failing to see the elephant in the room, the white elephant in the room, perhaps? What's driving this politics, and how can and I think the appeal to intersectionality and self-reflection is really important, and I really appreciate those points in your presentation. We have to look at ourselves as well as outwards, in the same way we have to look at domestic politics at the same time as thinking about foreign policy. Sorry, I'm going on a bit too much. I just wanted to sort of try and verbalize some of my thinking and yeah, my thoughts about this. But I think this is a great conversation. I encourage a focus on the other side of the dilemma, in a sense, the powerful patriarchal power brokers, and the way that the culture of this politics and therefore international polity gets infected with this. And I mean, Sweden is an interesting case study. The first country with a feminist foreign policy and a very, very long history of gender policies and equality, now having a right-wing government supported by an extreme right government, which happens to be the second largest party in the country, which is not in the government itself, but the government relies on their votes. So it's a very finely balanced horse trading, which means that they have jettisoned their feminist foreign policy, at least in the name. Sorry, I'll shut up and I'll
no,
there.
sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to react on that, Alejandra?
I think that probably Jutta is best placed to respond, but what I can say from my perspective is that I don't think there is one single solution to tackle some of the problems that we are trying to address, whether it's feminist foreign policy or other type of commitments. I think the important thing, at least for me, not speaking on behalf of the GQUAL campaign, but from a personal level, is that do we want to eliminate the patriarchal powers that we see exist in many countries? In my view, yes. Do we want to combat discrimination and some of the backlashes that we are seeing in many countries? Yes. Do we want to eradicate violence against women and girls and other groups? Yes. How we do it is important, but I think what's also important, including for feminist foreign policies, is to have some oversight, so that is not only a declaration of intentions. And I think the work that some civil society organizations are conducting to really check and produce indexes and indicators on how feminist foreign policies translate into real action are very important. And I don't think we have all the information out there yet. But as these policies develop and apply in practice, I think it's going to be very important to keep an eye just to make sure that indeed it's not just a statement, but is actually followed by real practice in the action of states.
Thank you so much. I think the oversight angle and the monitoring aspect as well is quite important. And I would like to build on that. I know there are more questions online, but I'm trying to be mindful of the time. So if you could just bear with me, because I would like to build on that and introduce Fridah, because Fridah is actually working a lot with communities, with marginalized communities, but also with CSOs. She is also an expert on land rights. So I would like Fridah to ask you share a bit in terms of implications when it comes to land rights, but also when it comes to involving meaningfully civil society organizations in questions and practices around feminist foreign policies. Yeah, you do have a mic here.
My brain is boiling from everything that I've heard, and I can tell you that this topic of FFP is a hot potato among the African women movement. We know that it could be a good thing, but we also know that it is a double-edged sword. So our eyes are very open. Even when she spoke about us needing oversight, I was like, but that is more unpaid care work. Why can't things just be done right so that we don't have to, provide that kind of an oversight, because things have been done so well. But anyway, I want to start with maybe throwing a question to the people who are here. Can foreign policies really be feminist? Because feminism is built on the realities of people of whom it impacts. A feminist policy should be built on the reality of people who it impacts. Foreign policies are built on the concept of othering. You're deciding how you're going to relate and engage with those others, those in Africa, those in the global south. So can really a foreign policy be feminist? I think that's something for us to think through. But the other concern about FFPs, at least in the African women movement, is if it turns out not to be authentic, if it turns out to be just a declaration of intent, the damage that it will have done in misrepresenting what feminism is. I just wanted to share that so that you understand the context within which I'm coming from, and of course the fact that this conversation are also going on in the African context. The previous speakers have said that feminism in itself is characterized by the challenge on patriarchy and all the other mutually, reinforcing systems of oppression, whether it's capitalism, racism, militarization of states in the global south, and all the other oppressive systems. So an authentic feminist foreign policy must then respond in disrupting those systems simultaneously. And I want to start there because if you think about the way marginalized communities are experiencing their land rights, and I'll give the context of Africa. Most of those problems, as much as they have been caused by lack of accountability on our part, on the government in Africa, they are also heavily contributed to by the global economic policies. Think about the large-scale investments going across different African countries, whether it is in agriculture, whether it is in water, in wildlife conservation, and how much it has pushed local communities into the peripheries and contributed to the lack of peace and security that we speak about today. So any foreign policy that claims to be feminist must be willing to challenge that status quo. It must be willing to challenge the inclusive business model that is implemented by the Dutch government in Africa that pushes farmers or reduces farmers to consumers in their own land. It must be ready and willing to confront the investments around water that are funded by governments of the global north and the impact that it has on local community. So the feminist foreign policy must cut across all the sectors of the economy. It must interact with trade policies, interact with the, global policies on water and all the other economic policies that keep suppressing women and girls and other marginalized populations. Then an authentic FFP would build on voice of agency of those fighting for land rights. And here I'm talking about land and environmental defenders, those who are defending women land rights. We would be seeing significant investment in those networks of people, whether they are in Latin America or in Africa, and we know the threats that they face upon their security and their human rights. So if really a country is investing in that kind of policy, then we need to see an increased investment in dealing with this issue. The other thing is around, still on land, is about that policy bringing the land agenda to the global political debates. If you watch carefully, the land agenda has been muted. The land ministries are muted. And the way to mute them is deny them budgets or make sure that the land agenda is not a priority issue in either the Sustainable Development Goal or all the other global discourses that are ongoing. So if the feminist foreign policy agenda is to contribute in advancing land rights, then the first role that it must play is to bring back that agenda to the global agenda. Because right now, people are not talking about land. CEDA, which was the pioneer, used to fund a lot of land work. They actually withdrew. Yet the issues of land rights for women, for indigenous people, remain a necessity up to today. It's as if we are moving in different direction. When the marginalized people say that we should invest here, then governments of the global north, e.g. CEDA, are moving in the opposite direction and redirecting their investments elsewhere. The other thing that we would see from a land rights perspective is because a lot of change has to be social, it's about attitude, it's about norm. Movements then become mandatory if we are to achieve land rights for the marginalized population. So a feminist foreign policy should prioritize in putting resources in grassroots movements, in movements of indigenous people, and in feminist organization. We spoke a bit about data. Data is very important, and data is political because it enables us to create narratives that shape how then we invest on certain issues. So the other area where we would want to see a feminist foreign policy invest in is on feminist research around land. Most of the research that is currently produced is to affirm why capitalism, it is the only model that is sustainable and can work. So we are reproducing, and it is intentional. So a feminist foreign policy should actually challenge that kind of traditional knowledge and bring forth knowledge that is first produced through a participatory process, but also is deepening the feminist analysis in that sector. The other area that then we would see transform is around land administration. We all agree that the land administration systems are very patriarchal, extremely patriarchal. That's why we are not making progress, even when we put gender policies in place, even when we've put gender action plan. So that transformation around in the public service, around people who provide land administrative services, then a feminist foreign policy would be investing in that area. It would not end its investment in development of policies, but also the administrative system that are ultimately responsible for provision of services at the grassroots level. Of course, the issue around the spirit and the intent is very important. I think for a long time, women, marginalized community, indigenous people have told us that land is not an economic good. It is a cultural identity. It's a source of life for them. It's a source of livelihood. And the way we have engaged with land as, as a global community is reducing it to an economic community. So even in the manner in which we project what land is, I would wish that these policies redefine how we engage with land, how we articulate what land is, and really borrow from those the lived realities of those people who are telling us that it is not just an economic commodity, it is also a cultural identity, and it's a source of their livelihood. I want to go to the next question. Do I still have time?
Maybe just building on what you're saying, because I think you've mentioned a couple of points which are quite important to distill and could be informative for building from land rights experience and expertise, right? But also for the whole security and rule of law ecosystem. I think you've mentioned, important points in terms of who sets the agenda, who are the stakeholders, how is knowledge produced, what is the role of knowledge, of indigenous knowledge, how do we redefine funding, which kind of business models do we use? And I think those questions are quite important, especially when we are talking about shaping, designing, programming interventions in fragile and conflict-affected settings. So maybe I would like to stop there for now and check online, because I know we had some questions, and also take this opportunity to let us know that we can now just dive deep into a proper Q&A, though we've been mixing pitches and questions as well. Melissa, what do we have online, if I may ask?
We have about 4 people contribute comments, not necessarily specific to Fridah's intervention.
Okay.
Maybe if there's anyone in the room who first has comments specifically on Fridah.
Yeah, go ahead, Nupu.
Thank you, Fridah. I think I just want to highlight that what you've said is so important about the double-edged sword, the fact that corporate accountability and that feminist foreign policies are not limited to our engagement with treaty bodies or development, but also trade and finance, and how the global north may be having domestic laws where they uphold human rights, but what that often results is corporations from the global north then outsource human rights violations to the global south. And if they're serious about feminist foreign policies, they have to look at supply chain issues. They have to be able to hold corporations coming from the global north accountable, which is very important even with the land rights issues in Africa. So I just wanted to flag that.
Related to what Fridah was saying. Yeah, Rhea, please go ahead.
Thank you, Fridah. I think when you were making your presentation, I think we were just so happy to see the word feminism as attached to a foreign policy. I think when Sweden first came out with that, with the feminist foreign policy, I think it was a refreshing way forward, especially with the backlash against, feminism. And it's true that, on the other hand, there's also a lot of, I would say, reframing around what feminism is, and it goes beyond what feminists intended it to be. So now we actually see it become like a commercial slogan. And I think that is also important to take note. But when you were making a presentation, I was also thinking, is this a case of the emperor's new clothes, where pretty much we probably need to call out what is expected from a feminist foreign policy and some of the difficult questions that we need to ask if we want it to be truly feminist. So in a way, I was thinking, well, surely we could have a grace period within which we can sort of use feminist. But I think after a while, we do need to call out, like, what does it mean? What are the hard decisions that one needs to make on that? And it's almost like a balancing scale. Like, we don't want that initiative we don't want to kill the initiative, but on the other hand, we're also mindful around how can we, I guess, grow or incubate it into how we want it to be, or to where our ambition leads us. So it's just a comment.
A call for UN Women to give a global direction. It might not be the right institution, but for now, it's what we have.
As we move forward, I would like to encourage us to think in terms of, okay, what the implications, the concrete implications when it comes to security and rule of law programming. We've started, and different speakers have done a great job in mentioning things like legitimacy, inclusion, movements building, funding, intersectionality. But let's try to make sure that we keep it not really narrowed, but straight to the point, so that we distill key implications for security and rule of law. What do we have online, Melissa, if I may ask? Just comments, or?
I think we have some comments on just overall how the event.
Okay, okay. Yeah?
Okay, so I think in order of contributions, Buluma, you were first to write something in the chat. So if you feel comfortable turning your camera and mic on to share it with the room, that would be great.
Can you hear us?
Hi, Buluma. We can see you, I think, but we can't hear you yet.
Yeah, thank you all for the opportunity. Unfortunately, I cannot be there in person, even though I was meant to be. Let me start from the last presentation, because it's two comments. One is to Fridah's. And I think thank you, Fridah, for the contributions of centering women in discussions on land and property rights. I think one of the key things we should have at the back of our minds in any such discussion, and legally we should ask, is who truly owns the land? Because as per the UN Women's Stats, less than 20% of the world's landholders are women. This number goes down to 15% in Sub-Saharan Africa, 5% in North Africa and West Asia. Contrast that with the fact that according to the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, 43% of the global agricultural labor force is composed of women. So we are disenfranchising a constituency that is actually the owners of the land in terms of the sweat they put into the land. And that is missing when we have all these forums and discussions, but that is also important. Thank you to Alejandra. The other point was on the importance of having women representation on the bench. It does make a difference, and it has made a difference. I was just saying that, for example, at the national level, a study was done within the Kenyan context, and it was found that having women judges actually led to their promoting feminist jurisprudence with specific regard to matrimonial and inheritance property issues. And the subsequent reforms, legislative reforms, as well as precedents in these two areas, helped a constituency which could not otherwise access the courts, yet are most affected by these disputes. And those are women and children. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And then I think, Daria, you were next.
Daria? It's fine. Yeah, please go ahead. Can you hear us? No worries. If not, maybe we can move forward. I would like to give the opportunity to Fridah to expand a bit on the civil society meaningful participation, because I think it was the other question you were supposed to reflect to, but also invite I guess, Alejandra, as part of your work as well, you probably interact with a lot of CSOs, organization, and how can we really make this meaningful for them in terms of movement building, in terms of funding, in terms of partnership, and really restoring that equilibrium? Let me start with you, Fridah.
Thank you, Messina. I think the question here is how we engage civil society organization in developing the feminist the FFPs.
We cannot hear you on that mic, so do you want to just switch it?
Yeah, so I will respond to civil society engagement in this whole discourse. And I want to start by saying, you know, the way people consume knowledge is also political. There is a lot of information that civil society organization in the Global South has produced, has documented, and has disseminated. So the first level of engagement is first consume the knowledge that is already out there, that as African feminists, as feminists from the Global South, as grassroots practitioners, that we've already produced, because then you already take into account our lived realities. Then the other thing is around creating space. I don't know whether I'm the only one, but I do feel like the discourse is very slim. It's also happening in very closed spaces. Sometimes we only learn because we are in partnership with international organizations that we share feminist values, the same feminist values, so they share that information. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. So there have to be a deliberate intent to create a space through which civil society, whether international, local, or grassroots, can be able to engage and share their thoughts. Of course, the issue of representation, the issue of engagement also require resources. So supporting those institutions, those collective with resources so that they can engage effectively, I think that's also another thing. And the last thing is just let's fix the immigration laws, or let's take these discourses where the grassroots people are. Getting grassroots people to come and engage here, or even in the US or wherever it may be, it's a nightmare for all of us. It's a nightmare because of the immigration law, and that's also an issue that the feminist policy should actually address. So either address those laws or bring the conversation where the grassroots communities are. Take this conversation to Mexico, to Peru, and all the other areas. Thank you.
Alejandra, would you like to say something?
I totally agree with Fridah, and we've had so many instances where colleagues could not come to the countries where conferences were being held on issues that affected them. And then the question is, why do we hold the events in the north? I mean, so I agree that we have to question some of the practices that we have seen on some of these issues, and that policies have to respond to the needs of people and the movement, as Fridah was saying before. It shouldn't be something that is developed top-down, but that responds to the needs, because we are talking about structural problems and practices that we want to eradicate, but they need to speak to the people who are experiencing those practices. So it has to be participatory in the way it is developed and implemented.
Great. Thank you so much. Question, comments, or maybe Jutta, would you like to say something on this? If not, I do have a question, but I'm just trying to check if there isn't any at this point.
One online.
Yeah?
So Daria was actually in the library and thus couldn't turn their mic on.
Yeah.
But just to vocalize their point also on sort of decentralizing from the West, the comment was, how could we at least theoretically implement feminist foreign policy in traditionalist third world countries without westernizing them and making them abandon culture and religion that contradicts feminist theory? In these states, feminism is labeled as a Western notion that will colonize their country.
Shall we maybe start with Dr. Jutta? You've been a bit silent.
Well, I've been attentively listening and been really grateful for all the contributions, or all what I've heard so far. And it's a privilege to be here. Yeah, sometimes I think I'm taking back to the 1970s and 80s when the term feminism, or when the international women's movement developed, the term feminist international policy, and went on to educate their southern sisters, and it became just a lightning rod for women in the global south to say this is another form of imperialism. And I think we haven't, to some extent, we haven't learned. We just haven't learned. It continues to be kind of something invented by the North, and then kind of transported through international organizations and governments to the global South. And I couldn't agree more with Fridah to say a feminist foreign policy needs to be informed by the voices, by those who are affected, by the indigenous knowledge. And they need to be part and parcel of this. If you are really true to a feminist foreign policy, we're speaking about values, and what we're practicing at the moment is not, in some respects, feminist values. So we really, the way we do it is also to really be inclusive, to bring those voices to the fore, but also not allow leaders in both the West or the North and the South to, and this goes back to Jurker's point, to not instrumentalize that term feminism and to make it a lightning rod. This is important because I think there is something to a feminist policy in politics, but it's become so politicized by anti-feminist forces that we need to also claim it and own it and defend it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jutta. Anyone else? Would you like to react on this? It's on.
So I want to react to the comment around feminism being Western. I think that's it's a narrative of the anti-feminist movement. So first of all, we need not recite it, and we should not even be carrying it on in our narrative, because then we are empowering them. Feminism cannot be Western because women in Africa have challenged patriarchy since the pre-colonial periods. When Winnie Mandela stood to, fight apartheid, what was that? She was challenging patriarchy. I don't think she had learned that from the West. There are many women from my country who took up leadership as chiefs during those days when it was not fashionable for them to do that. So I don't think it is it's Western, and we have to tell our story. Maybe tell it louder than the anti-feminist movement do. The other thing is how we can make the FFP a reality in traditional, did you say traditional third world countries? I think that's what, yeah? That was the I think that's what we've been talking about. Perhaps what I could just add is that when we want to fix things that are around engineering, we give the engineers the space to provide leadership. I think we should create space for the feminists, the experienced feminists, to actually help us design what these FFPs are. I don't think governments is the space where you'll find a lot of the experienced feminists. So the governments need to open up to engage with those outside government who understand feminist analysis, what feminism is, and who has invested deeply and many years in understanding this theory to help them create those policies.
Yeah. Would you like to say something? Because we are moving towards the end of the event, but before I wrap up and offer you the opportunity to say any final word, I'm just checking with Alejandra on this specific question.
No, I think to some extent I would be repeating, but maybe just to highlight the important role that civil society will have in the future as we keep on thinking on this topic. It's not only a theoretical discussion, but I think we have to insist and really have an active role in watching how the debate, but also the policies are being implemented, to watch how the policies develop from the South. I think that's really interesting that lots of countries are developing their policies, even countries with high percentages of indigenous populations, such as Chile, for example. Colombia is also developing a feminist foreign policy. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to learn from some of those countries and see if what comes out of their policies is different to the policies that are being proposed from the North.
Thank you so much. I do have mine. Thanks. Any final question before the wrap-up? No? All right.
Just there's a few comments that I don't think we'll have time to address, but will the speakers feel comfortable if they can be reached out to via email for some of these questions later after the event? Okay, great. We can put them in touch directly then.
Well, good. Thanks so much. I think you've all done a great job, both the speakers, but also throughout different interventions to show that there are a dichotomy in terms of what needs to be from a theoretical or conceptual point of view, in terms of making sure that the real and all the nuances around terminology, the term feminism, and what we really, what is understood by a feminist foreign policy is distilled. We do see the need to make sure that this is not instrumentalized, this is not politicized, this doesn't produce, let's say, this doesn't become counterproductive in terms of achieving the aim behind the feminist foreign policy. So while we do appreciate the interest from the academia in terms of unpacking, understanding, laying the foundations of what a feminist foreign policy should be, or even what feminism should mean from different perspectives, I think from different interventions it was also clear that at this stage already, there are concrete values that can be leveraged on when it comes to feminism and feminist foreign policy. And I think you've mentioned a couple, just to mention a few: intersectionality, legitimacy, human rights-based approach. And I think more practically, you've also highlighted how security and rule of law as a sector can both contribute but also adjust in terms of movement building, in terms of funding, in terms of designing meaningful programs, implementing and creating policies which really aligns with the realities of people they are supposed to affect. And I've really appreciated how in different interventions there is that like the cruciality of pushing the boundaries and going beyond traditional policies, but also going beyond legal norms, legal treaties, and making sure that feminist approaches can also be used when it comes to business model, when it comes to trade cooperation. So thank you very much all. I was just wondering, any final word you would like to share? I would like to offer this opportunity to our three speakers. If there is anything you would like to, as a closing remark, it can be a word, a sentence. If not, no pressure. No?
How will all this wisdom from the room get to the Dutch government?
Very important one. So maybe I can quickly react on that before Alejandra gets the opportunity. This conversation sits within a trajectory of conversation on feminist foreign policies. And from now, we will be distilling actually what you've been sharing in terms of conceptual framework, but also more practically when it comes to programming and policy. And we will have more conversation tailored to policymakers, but also some other conversation at a more grassroots level. I think you may know that the Knowledge Platform is this year hosting the annual conference in Nairobi, Kenya in November. So we are really also looking forward to the conference to make sure that we zoom in and we create the space for grassroots movement as well. So stay tuned for sure. This is not going to be the end of it. Alejandra.
So in terms of our word, maybe hope, because there is a lot to be done, whether it's through this tool or other tools. And in terms of international participation of women, just to say that we will continue the conversation. We are going to have at the GQUAL campaign another event in Geneva to unpack what this means for those who are there and work before the UN, but we are also continuing the discussion with the CEDAW committee in the context of developing the general recommendations. So I see this, as you say, Messina, as part of an ongoing discussion that we very much need to have.
Great. Thank you so much, Alejandra. Dr. Jutta?
Sorry, I've been freezing again, and it looks like I am again. Anyhow, I would like to thank, and I just can reiterate what I said. I am hopeful that this at least becomes a corrective, a vision that we need to push, and I can only encourage for us not to let it be taken out of our hands and let it be run as a narrative in and of it by itself, that we really need to assert our agency in structuring and in making it a reality.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We do really appreciate your interest in this very important topic. And as I said, stay tuned. But before that, I'm sure Melissa has a survey. So we do appreciate your feedback, both in terms of content and format of the conversation, and we would like to build on that to shape future conversations. So yeah, if you could just maybe quickly scan, but I'm also sure that if you've registered, you will receive this in your emails as well. Great, otherwise have a great evening and thank you so much. Thank you for those who joined online as well. Thank you very much.
Melissa, I just wanted to thank you. Thanks for having